afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you, as president of the Danube Institute, to the first of two events this week on the topic of conservatism. Today we have three distinguished guests: Professor Ofir Haivry, the new fellow and a distinguished Israeli scholar, the founder of the magazine Azure, senior fellow at the Herzl Institute, and, as I say, our new fellow here. Secondly, Professor Ferenc Hörcher of the National Civil Service University, and Rod Dreher, the distinguished American writer on religion and politics. And also, not coincidentally, now the director of our network program here at the Institute. And Rod, you may, if you wish, want to say something about that. But our topic is conservatism. Today, and I actually mean today, this very day, there are terrible riots occurring in Paris over what looks like the murder of a young French girl, and terrible eruptions of anarchy in, of all places, the British Conservative Party. Both of these events are very relevant to our topic, our common topic, especially the second, because conservatism can be seen historically not as a generator of disorder and anarchy, but as a civilized response and solution to it. This point was made most powerfully in the famous essay by Professor Samuel Huntington in 1958 in the American Political Science Review, in which he attempted to reach a non-ideological definition of conservatism. Professor Huntington looked at several eruptions of conservative thought in European history, for instance, Edmund Burke's response to the French Revolution, against which he examined various theories of conservatism. He concluded that conservatism was not a narrowly specific ideology justifying aristocratic resistance to the French Revolution, for instance. Burke, after all, had defended not only feudal French institutions, but also commercial English and princely Indian institutions with the same conservative arguments. Nor was conservatism an autonomous system of ideas, universally valid, such as order, balance, moderation, which any intelligent person might embrace, for it did not appear in history at all times, but only randomly, and at times of great political upheaval. Conservatism, Huntington concluded, was that system of ideas employed to defend established institutions against fundamental attack. As he himself put it, when the foundations of society are threatened, the conservative ideology reminds men of the necessity of some institutions and the desirability of existing ones. The impulse to conservatism, he concluded, comes from the social challenge before the theorist, not the intellectual tradition behind him. Applying this logic to the new conservatism of Bill Buckley in the United States, Huntington argued in effect that it was really only half a conservatism. Those new conservatives who were mainly concerned to oppose international communism as a fundamental attack to American liberal institutions, those he could endorse. The international communist threat in the 50s was a real one, and so was the conservatism opposing it real. Domestically, however, America under its 50s liberal dispensation was in a state of such prosperous contentment that there was no real challenge to existing institutions, and so he thought the new conservatives were flailing at ideological windmills rather than at real enemies. But Huntington argued that this political peace would not last long. American liberal institutions, he forecast, this is the late 50s, would soon come under radical attack, and then liberals would have to resort to conservative arguments in order to defend them. Now, as we know, that turned out to be a remarkably accurate prediction. A decade later, the 60s, radicals issued a comprehensive denunciation of the reigning American liberalism and its central institutions, namely the university. They were denounced as oppressive. Many liberals capitulated very easily and quickly, and embraced the radical critique as their own. But a minority rejected it forcefully, developed a politics built around it, built around defending liberalism against the radical challenge, and neoconservatism was born. I should just say, in parentheses, that the first generation of neoconservatives are very different from the second, are interested in different issues, and they're really, it's a confusion to think of them as a continuing tradition. But others may disagree. The neoconservatives, having been born, were then subsumed into the pre-existing US conservatism that also included libertarians, moral traditionalists, cultural conservatives, and nationalists. Paradoxically, then, one early and important result of the 60s revolution was to push the United States into developing a varied and sophisticated conservatism that won the 1980 election and the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War, 1989, left a disorienting ideological flux, with socialist economics discredited by the Soviet collapse. The social democratic left, here and in America, embraced the market economy, made itself respectable, and occupied territory that used to belong to the right. Conservatives had nothing solid to fight against, and therefore nothing particular to say. In response, many conservatives on the center-right ceased to be recognizably conservative. I would instance the German Christian Democrats, and gradually moved leftwards. But just as the French Revolution was preceded by a long period in which the Ancien regime was subjected to philosophical criticism, but not to serious political attack, in the same way, left progressive critiques of Western democracy spread slowly through the West's own cultural and political institutions until quite suddenly, almost yesterday, we find them being enforced comprehensively in business, technology, the media, the courts, and everywhere almost, with the significant exception of elected and accountable democratic institutions. Yes, they have spread there. Some cases, America's at the moment, they control governments, but they don't hold them permanently and securely. So the next challenge to conservatives, it seemed to me, is going to be the gradual undermining of institutions of majoritarian democracy rooted in the consent of the government and in a shift of power and decision-making from institutions that are accountable to voters from those institutions to institutions which are accountable to no one but themselves. I think we see this shift in three developments. The shift of power from legislatures to bureaucratic agencies and the courts brought about by over-government. The shift of power from nation states to supranational bodies under political and legal globalism, and the development of anti-democratic ideas that, though they lag behind events, have recently advanced late in the day to justify these new political practices and to defend the new loci of power. If I were one of today's speakers, you may be surprised at this point to learn I'm not, I would discuss how conservatism would deal with these threats. The current turmoil in the Conservative Party illustrates how British Conservative there is signally failing to do so or to show much understanding of the challenges British society faces. But I'm a humble moderator. Unfortunately, our lecture on Thursday by Professor David Starkey on conservatism after Boris will, I am sure, give us better directions than almost any of the Tory leaders seem to have up their very empty sleeves. You know. For whatever reasons, therefore, in all of our countries, we see different forms of conservatism competing for our attention to provide solutions to Huntington's overall problem. Now, our first speaker, is Professor Haivry, Ofir Haivry, and who, as I mentioned, is the Vice President of the Herzl Institute of Jerusalem and a co-founder of the Edmund Burke Foundation in Washington, D.C. He has a PhD from the University of London. His fields of research are the history of political thought, and especially the Anglo-American tradition, as well as Jewish political thought. He has published an important book, John Selden and the Western Political Tradition, Cambridge University Press, as well as many reflections in academic books and numerous essays. He's, as I say, currently a visiting fellow of the Danube Institute, researching traditions of European conservatism. I will say just briefly about his book, John Selden and Western Political Thought. Probably the most single expert living, most distinguished expert on the period in which Hobbes, Locke, Selden, and others were writing and debating and discussing is Noel Malcolm, whose own books are very important. He gave the most glowing tribute to Professor Haivry. The book on John Selden and Western Political Thought is an almost revolutionary redefinition of conservatism if conservatives went in for revolutionary redefinitions, because it suggests that the sources of English liberties, American liberties, and indeed Western liberties, given Burke's your continental influence, there are sources of Western liberties that do not draw upon or derive from John Locke's own work in his two great books. Instead, they come from a different tradition of legal argument, so our liberties come really from legal practice and experience and common law traditions, as much as they do from what used to be called geographic principles, geometric principles. And so, having given you this introduction, I want now to introduce Professor Haivry with great anticipation.
Thank you, John. So I titled my presentation to you as a letter from the old conservatives to the new. And some will remember what I'm referring to. Once upon a time, when I was young, almost no one wanted to be a conservative. I'm exaggerating a bit, of course, but to most people in the 1960s and 70s, to be a conservative basically meant to be someone who manages decline. The future, it was said, belonged to the ideas of socialists and progressive liberals. Conservatives, it seemed, were those who simply wanted to travel in the same direction, only slower. Then a great conservative revival occurred, the political expression of which were leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Their conservatism was rooted in tradition, national identity, political and economic liberty, but it was at the same time also far more active and dynamic in seeking to address the challenges from the left. So in the 1980s, this active conservatism fought against the state, the idea that the state should own and manage the means of production. And this battle, we know, it won and transformed the economies and the societies of the West and then of the whole world. Basically, there isn't any viable society, I think, outside of North Korea that believes that the government should actually manage and own the means of production. It also, this active conservatism also fought against Soviet hegemony and brought down communism in Europe. However, as we say in my country, Israel, failure is an orphan, but success has many fathers. And so suddenly, from the 1990s onwards, the term conservative became far more popular than before that. Suddenly, social liberals and anti-democratic authoritarians and even racists who before had derided conservatism, now started to call themselves conservatives. These new conservatives were and are everything and its opposite, to the point that the term is losing its meaning in political terms. Just to give an example, in various European countries, there are so-called conservatives who support homosexual marriage. On the other hand, Putin's government is also described as conservative. So now, obviously, both cases cannot be right. Or the term conservative simply loses any meaning. I will argue that none of these new model conservatives are conservatives at all. But in order to do so, we will have to be clearer about the ideas and values that are conservative and those who are not. So most of you have probably encountered the account that argues that conservatism, like nationalism, was born out of the French Revolution, or rather against it. This is, of course, wrong. Not only because absolutely nothing good came out of the French Revolution, but also because conservatives who opposed the revolution, like Edmund Burke and Alexander Hamilton and many others in continental Europe, were arguing that they were defending some ideas and values that existed beforehand. So either we have to decide that they were lying, or we should look into what were these pre-revolutionary ideas that existed according to them for a long time. Now I know that some of you might resist the idea that nothing good came of the French Revolution because it had been drummed into many heads that things like rights and democracy had their source in the revolution. But I urge you to consider Edmund Burke's warning that even seemingly good things coming out of the French events were poisoned at the source, so that even ideas which appear sound are actually based on unsound values. Moreover, Burke and Hamilton and others held that values like political liberties, property rights, and representative government did not originate in the revolution or its principles, but much earlier. Indeed, Burke and others argue that these earlier origins existed not only in Britain and America. They argue that they also existed in France and in other European countries, that what was needed to counter the revolution was a will and effort to recover this tradition in each country, instead of following the false lights coming out of Paris. I will not be able to describe today all these earlier origins in other countries. That will have to wait for another occasion. I will focus instead on the English tradition. By doing so, I will describe what are the general conservative principles, as well as those who are not. In the main, I argue that the notion of representative government and of traditional rights emerged in several European countries, roughly between 1300 and 1600. In England, these ideas enjoyed continuity and stability because of the rise of parliament as a permanent institutions, which we know in other cases it didn't happen. I mean, parliaments existed in some countries, but were not very regular and stable. This connection of representation and rights was established first and foremost because the English parliament began and long remained the supreme English court of law. Now, why should that be the case? That is possible because of the English national tradition about their own laws. This tradition held, indeed still holds, that overall, English laws had no beginning in some specific sovereign act, but rather that these laws developed historically with common practice. Therefore, as early as the year 1066, William the Conqueror was pledging to respect the traditional laws of the English. I'm talking about almost 1,000 years ago. And then the Magna Carta of 1215, as well as its numerous later ratifications, always reaffirm and restore this principle that we are protecting laws that are long established. They never say we are inventing or agreeing on some new laws. This vision of English law meant that it was always regarded as a national law. It wasn't the law that was the will of the king or some council, but a law that was a sum of the traditions of the whole nation. As such, even 400 and 500 years ago, it was described as something that both made the nation and was made by it. Therefore, such laws could be only changed by common consent of the whole nation as represented in parliament. And then you see how representation and traditional rights became enmeshed together in the English tradition. That is why again and again, in periods of political turmoil, the English solution to the crisis was to declare a return to the traditional national laws. Thus, in 1628, after several rounds of political clashes, the king in parliament issued something called the Petition of Right. It was drafted by John Selden and Sir Edward Coke, and it reaffirmed the Magna Carta and other old laws. In 1660, after the turmoil of the Civil War period, there was a formal restoration of the traditional constitution. And similarly, the Glorious Revolution of 1689 was declared by Parliament to be a restoration of the old constitutional order after King James II had attempted to overturn it. In all these events, the common point stressed was the reassertion of traditional national law safeguarding historical rights. This is the English understanding of their own tradition. This is basically, I'm arguing, what English conservatives were trying to conserve. Of course, there were attempts to argue differently. Radicals justified, some still justify, the short-lived regicide English Republic of the 1650s. And John Locke, following this radical tradition or inheritance, tried to argue in his second treatise on government that 1689 was a continuation of the same ideals. However, at that time, no one of importance, listened to him. And the mainstream Whig tradition stressed again and again the continuity, rather the break of the so-called Glorious Revolution. The word revolution at that time was understood like a revolver, meaning it goes back to the same place. Today we use revolution as thinking this way, and it's the opposite of what was before. But actually, they said the circle has been closed. So, when the French Revolution arrived, the constitutionalists who who regarded themselves as the heir of this tradition of Selden and Coke, prominent among them Edmund Burke, who mentions these figures in his reflections. These constitutionalists came to be termed Old Whigs because of their adherence to the national traditions, against the New Whigs who supported the French Revolution, claiming correctly that the French ideals were those of Locke. Thus, just like at the time of the Revolution, there were Old Whigs, were conservatives, and New Whigs who wanted to adopt the liberal views of Locke, we have now Old Conservatives and New Conservatives. So, I will make a small detour to make a point that I believe is the source for all meaningful debate of political ideologies. Like all political philosophies, like conservatism, are ultimately based on an idea of human knowledge. Meaning, what can we know or how can we know it? Because our idea of how we know things then influences the way that we think that we can act or we can't act in politics, in society. So, one idea of human knowledge is called rational individualism. It holds that every individual knows things, first and foremost, based on his rational thought. This individual doesn't really need any prior knowledge of things like history, nor really the assistance of others to know and understand the world. Eventually, his own understanding, his own rationalism will lead him to understand things more or less like any other rational being in a geometrical manner of understanding. And this is the philosophical basis for political liberalism. Another idea of human knowledge is based on the senses. It argues that we learn and understand things and the world based on our senses. What we feel, what we perceive, what we see. We perceive the material world around us, and then ideas are born out of this perception of the senses. This is the basis for materialistic political ideologies like socialism, basically. I argue that conservatism is based on a different idea of human knowledge. An idea that Selden and others already discussed at length in the 17th century. One example so this idea of human knowledge is that we learn to know things mainly through traditions that preceded us and we are transmitted. One such tradition is language, which we of course receive from our elders as we grow, and we have nothing to say in a manner about it until we are grown up. And even then, I think a language defines very much what and the way in which we think. In this view, our reason and our senses have a role, but they are guided by the traditions we inherit. For example, we all know that we often find some smell enticing that another culture finds disgusting. I was in China, and it turns out that for many Chinese, the smell of any milk product is disgusting. And to me, a cheese or milk is fine. So I think that this shows that our smell too is guided by our culture. The same is true for ideas, so that the idea of having men kill themselves for our entertainment in the arena, which the Romans thought alluring, we found disgusting because of our biblical moral inheritance, not because it's natural to be so, because in other cultures, gladiators or human sacrifice was retained as perfectly acceptable. But we must not mistake tradition for immobility. All these traditions we receive from our elders are tested, and sometimes those who find lacking disappear while others are accepted. Let's remember that Europe once was polytheistic, and now it's Christian, or apparently so, in some cases. But let's go maybe not for such sublime things, but more mundane ones. We might consider what would traditional Italian food or Hungarian food be without tomato or capsicum. But both of these arrived in Europe only after discovery in America, and they gradually were adopted and became mainstays of several natural cuisines. So again, this is the point that a tradition doesn't mean something that remains the same all the time. This is, by the way, why, at least in philosophical terms, I prefer to talk about traditionalism than conservatism, because traditionalism is something different. However, traditionalism alone is not yet political conservatism. There are two additional stabilizing elements that are necessary. The first is national identity, and the second is a set of values that stands outside of the tradition. Why do we need these? National identity is necessary in order to give tradition a solidity, the weight to stand on its own without being swept away by outside forces. By solidity, I mean that every tradition always is under pressure from various outside influences, and it often imports elements from outside as it exports some. But in order to endure and thrive, there must be some extent of shared historical continuity, some things that are worth clinging to even in the face of outside pressure. A tradition that is one of only a city or a region can and is far more easily swept away than a national one. So, for example, when the Christian religion came under pressure in many European countries dominated by the Ottoman Empire, many city-states and regional traditions disappeared forever, while in other places where the Christian tradition resisted, it became intimately intertwined with the national identity. That was the case in Greece and in Serbia and in Hungary. So this is about the necessity of a national identity. The last element I mentioned is a set of values that sound outside of the tradition. Without such independent values, a tradition becomes simply self-referring and loses both moral value and the capability to correct itself. Therefore, in great cultures such as Greece and Rome, there was never a serious objection to slavery. And the same is true for China and India. In none of these great traditions, who had many great things, no one came up with the idea that slavery is a bad thing. indeed, the values of the Bible were necessary to gradually extinguish slavery, first in Europe and later all around the world. I argue that these are the values which impacted this practice, and I can bring other examples, but this is very obvious. The same is true, in a sense, for political rights. It was a very slow process that began in the Middle Ages based on biblical ideas of human dignity and choice, gradually expanding political rights and participation, first to all independent men, then to all adult males, and then also to adult women. Those who think such rights were born in the French Revolution are misguided, because such rights already existed, at least for some, in several European countries, as well as in Britain and the US, before the revolution. While we see that political systems that regarded themselves as heirs to the revolution, like Napoleon's empire and the Soviet Union, did not think any such political rights necessary. Now, these three elements, traditionalism, nation, and biblical values, are thus the crucial elements of political conservatism, certainly in the West. The reason that they are crucial is that they are independent of political power, so that by their very nature, they cannot really be completely controlled by that power. Naturally, all authoritarian regimes seek to control and subdue these principles, to destroy them or at least neutralize them, because they are independent of them. However, not only dictators fear these principles, but liberals too, because these principles undermine the liberal concept of an extreme individualist society. To better understand this issue, we should bear in mind that against tradition, nation, and biblical values, liberal offers three alternative principles designed to undermine the conservative ones. And these I will term individual consent, the state, and abstract human rights. You must be asking yourself, what is the problem with the liberal principles I mentioned? Because they sound perfectly plausible. But my point is that exactly because they sound plausible, each of these three possess indeed some positive aspects. However, they are used to undermine the foundation of the conservative values. Let us start with individual consent. This is the cornerstone of liberalism. Remember, as I mentioned before, individual consent is based on the liberal idea of independent, rational knowledge in the individual. According to this idea, society is made of independent individuals who consent to take part in it, but always retain the power to consent or refuse every aspect. Thus, traditional notions of marriage, of education, of sexuality can be rejected because they are not the result of individual choice. According to the idea of consent, the right of the individual to determine his partner, his gender, his values, is only limited by his materially hurting another. If you are not materially hurting another, you can do whatever you want. Thus, the traditional values of society become meaningless or even an obstacle to the total freedom of the individual. The examples of where this is leading us are before us, but of course, this is only the beginning. Where else this can lead to, I think that I will bring an example. In Germany, only about 15 years ago, a brother and a sister from Leipzig demanded to be legally married. Both were of age. They argued, and I quote, that their right to sexual self-determination had been discriminated against. So it's a human rights claim. Although the German courts denied the request, they did so only on utilitarian grounds, meaning that there was a possible damage to the children, because these people also had children. But what if there were no children? What would have been the argument of the court then? And by 1214, a majority of the legally established German Ethics Council, it's a national body dealing with ethics, had voted to propose a decriminalization of consensual incest between adults. So if this way of thinking goes on, the day is not far when such marriages will be allowed. In Germany and in other countries, it is the natural result of an ethics of consent. The second liberal principle is preferring the state rather than the nation as the unit of social community. At first glance, that doesn't look so problematic. After all, the state is the arena for our collective political actions and those of the government. However, the state, remember, is a mechanical entity. In itself, it has no collective character, no values, no purpose, because those all come, I argue, from the nation. Nations are all political. States are universal. In liberal theory, the state is a social contract, an association of individuals where nation or religion or history have no role. Therefore, if on the one hand the nation is the primary unit of association, then the state serves the nation. The nation exists before the state. It can also exist without the state. We know that some nations were occupied or divided, and the nation continued to exist. And then the nation, if it's then the state, if it's a national state, can be connected to history and to particular preferences in culture, in education, in immigration. But if, on the other hand, the state itself is regarded as the principle of association in place of national culture, then there is no role or real importance for history. There is multiculturalism in space of national culture, and there can be unrestricted immigration from abroad, since all states are basically the same, and all immigrants are citizens, are merely individuals. Currently, I would say that the various European states are, for the most part, still too close to the nation to be completely at the mercy of these liberal ideals. And so liberals today propose a new kind of state, a European superstate that will be, by definition, unbound by national identity, and then it will be far easier to justify these values. I'm coming to the third principle of the third liberal principle against conservatism, which is the concept of abstract human rights, coming from nature or from rational geometrical inquiry. Again, at first glance, this seems to be absolutely fine. What can be bad about human rights? But the problem is that this principle is intended to replace biblical values, meaning there are a system of values that comes from the Bible, but if there is a system that comes from nature or rational inquiry, the question is, maybe it should replace these biblical ideas which maybe some people do not agree with. The reason for this attempt to replace biblical ideas is that biblical values are independent of our will and our consent. We might interpret them, we might even reject them, but we cannot change them. Abstract human rights, on the other hand, are liberal constructs. They are in constant change, depending on fashions and inventions. That is, although they are described as being universal and constant, they are not. So, for example, 200 years ago, human rights did not include political equality for women. Then, about 100 years ago, it was discovered suddenly that women do have equal rights, and so they could vote and be elected and participate even in Olympic sports. But now, it seems that new rights have been discovered, so that now biological males have a right to compete in women's sport and to be sent to a women's prison. And why not be elected to a political position that is assigned to a woman's quota? If something as unstable as our reason and will is the only criterion for rights, we cannot hope for them to ever achieve any stability. Well, I'm concluding by pointing out that all of this Edmund Burke knew or suspected even before the French Revolution. I can bring various examples, but in a famous speech of 1782, that is 7 years before the Revolution, he was speaking against a proposed radical political reform. And then he warned, "I know there is an order that keeps things fast and in their place. It is made to us, and we are made to it. If we cannot keep this order, if we throw it away, then why not ask for another wife, for other children, another body, another mind?" It is then high time we recognize, this is not Burke, this is now me. It is then high time that we recognize this. Many of these who call themselves conservatives are not so. Unfortunately, it's unrealistic for us to expect that these new conservatives stop using the term to define themselves. After all, they are using the term conservative exactly because of the defects of their own ideologies that properly termed as liberalism or authoritarianism have less takers. So they try to describe themselves as conservatives. But I think that we can and should be more rigorous on our part in the way that we use the term. We should make it clear that a conservative is not someone who follows the false idols of extreme individualism or the state or invented rights, but rather one who believes in tradition and in the nation and in the values, the traditional values of the Bible. Thank you.
Well, Professor Haivry, the first thing I want to say, my first by way of comment, is I very much want that article for the Hungarian Conservative before anyone else gets to bid for it. So thank you very much indeed. That was a marvelous range of the territory, particularly since it began with the demolition of Huntington and Mine's non-ideological version of conservatism. Now, I want to now turn to our second speaker, Professor Ferenc Hörcher, of course, locally well known, the author himself of an important work on conservatism. And now I come to think of it, Ferenc, your stress on moderation in your definition of conservatism demolishes Huntington's second explanation of what conservatism might be. But as a political philosopher, a historian of political thought, and a philosopher of art, who studied in Budapest, Brussels, has been a director of the Research Institute of Politics and Government, and a senior researcher at the Institute of Philosophy at the Hungarian Academy of Science, and has visited and spoken at and held positions in other distinguished European universities. I would like, and I would add another point. I would say you are the local representative of the thought of Roger Scruton as well, who has been a strong influence in this country, partly because of your introductions of him. So let me invite you now to make your contribution.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honored to be here, and I am happy to contribute to this discussion from my own point of view. Ofir, you wrote your letter to the new conservatives from the perspective of the old conservative. Now the question is, which side am I now? Because apparently you are younger than me. So then I'm not sure. I was born in '64.
Exactly the same age.
I was born in February.
Okay, so you're older by 3 months.
Okay, you see. So that's one logical problem for me. The other one is an interesting variety of backgrounds to the four of us. John coming from the British English context, you yourself from the Israeli context, and Rod, you coming from the American one. Myself, I am coming from the communist past. So I was born in a country under communist rule and brought up here. So in a way, I have got a different perspective. Samuel Huntington was not an issue for me. The issue for me was how to survive in a communist country and keep my sense of my identity as well. Brought up in a Catholic family, which had its traditions of referring back to 1956 as a reference point of revolution against communism, by communists actually, or partly by communists. So That's the tradition I was brought up in. And then I had a good chance to go to study in Oxford. And that's where I discovered for myself Edmund Burke. And that was the late 80s, when the Thatcher-Reagan era was still on, and when the Cold War consensus was still alive between conservatives and liberals. So that's for me the starting points, the starters. And in that sense, that's for me old conservatism. So in a sense, that's a different perspective, because this conservatism is anti-communist, and this conservatism takes classical liberalism as an ally in the fight. And that's presented by the case of Thatcher and Reagan, who very successfully defended that cause. Your friend and colleague Yoram Hazony, of course, argues that at the end of the game, of course, communism has fallen, and that's great. But similarly, conservatism also has fallen. That's his argument, because what was winning was the liberal cause. And that's Fukuyama's point. So what happened with conservatism in that situation when communism is over? What is remaining here? And I would say that the next point that is important for us today, if we want to discuss this old new conservatism, is the age of Brexit and Trump. These two phenomena which happened in the same time and which caused a real turmoil in politics as well as in ideology. And as a result of those two very surprising events, which no one actually have foreseen, or at least I did not. This resulted in new ideas brought to the conservative scene as well. And two of the directions in the US and one in Britain I should mention. And these are national conservatism on the one side and integralism or common good constitutionalism on the other side. These are two developments which argue that you have to give up that Cold War consensus of conservatism and liberalism, and you should go for something better, something more fundamental, and perhaps you would say something older as well. My question is, well, even if, let's suppose you are right or they are right, whether that's a winning strategy or not, that's my question. And just to mention the British post-Brexit Trump development, I would call it post-liberalism. That's the ideology which comes up in the British context, which is arguing some way differently, and I don't want now to embark on that because it's not connected closely to Ofir's point of view. So why do I think that it's not perhaps the best way to go for a more fundamentalist and more tradition-based conservatism? John, you mentioned my book on conservatism, and you mentioned one of the key terms in it, moderation, which can be important in this respect. But there is one term which is even more important in that book, and that is prudence, practical wisdom, phronesis in the ancient Greek version, or prudentia in the Latin version. And that's I claim that conservatism is the ideology or the worldview or the political thought which is based on that virtue, which is a cardinal virtue in a Catholic sense, but it goes back to the ancient ideas of virtue. And for my hero in this respect is Aristotle. And phronesis is confronted or contrasted with Sophia, wisdom. And the idea is that wisdom is very important for our contemplation, while prudence or phronesis is important for our politics, for our practical affairs, for our personal life here and now. And if that's the case, then what we need is a prudential politics in conservatism, a winning strategy in conservatism. It's not enough to be right in politics. What is needed is to win, because otherwise you cannot make true your ideals. So you need a pragmatic approach, a practical approach, and a winning approach. And that's why I say that the two basic notions are very important and even true, but that they do not need to be so much stressed or emphasized as you do. And the two terms that I have in mind is the nation and the Bible. That's perhaps strange for someone coming from Hungary, which is par excellence a nation which wanted to defend its sovereignty, its national independence. Our prime minister defines himself as a freedom fighter. We take freedom of our nation as the basic value. But my claim is that if we go for the nation, we can go astray from our target, which is to win. We have to win the majority for us. And in a time when the West is in a position of multiculturalism, it's not easily a winning strategy to go for the nation. So, and the more so actually not in Europe, because in Europe the nation sounds much better than in the British context. In Britain, which is a united kingdom per definition by its very name, it's very difficult to go for the nation because it can be a divisive issue. And the same is true about the UK, which is, the United Kingdom, which is a united republic of very different traditions and political cultures, a melting pot of them, actually. So you cannot go for a well-defined national identity and get the majority of the votes, I argue. And the same is true about biblical values. We are living in a secular age, in a post-ideological secular age, when religious values in the West, and we are talking about the West in this context, are declining. The majority is not behind them anymore. So you have to realize that you need something to address those people who don't believe anymore. And you cannot go for them with your biblical values because they will not be convinced. You have to convince them in a short run. You cannot have a generation to educate them and so on. And that's why I say that you need something else, and that's natural law. That's my argument. What you can rely on is the natural law, because the natural law is something that cannot be denied by liberals, by socialists, by anyone who is reasonable enough in the Western sense of the word. So I would argue that, I can accept the truth of national conservatism. I can accept the basic values, including tradition, nation, and biblical values, but I propose as a political strategy not to push those ideas to the forefront, but rather to go for a wide majority. You need to ally, like with the classical liberals who also got frustrated by wokeism, by cancel culture. So they are needed. And also, I would go for the ecological thinkers, because conservatism has a lot to say, even more to say about ecology and the conservation of nature than the left. So we have got here again a point where we can win over others beyond our own camp. So that's my proposal. If it's a new one, let it be. If it's an old one which relies on the age-old strategies of Hungarians who were left between the great empires of the Germans and the Slavs and the Turks and the Mongols and all those external powers who were more powerful than us, we had to learn how to live with that. And I myself, brought up in a communist country, know that you cannot go against Russian tanks naked-handed and with your true ideas. It's not enough, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ferenc. And now let me introduce our final speaker, Rod Dreher, who is well known to most of us here. I think he is, of course, a senior editor at the American Conservative magazine. He's the author of several best-selling books, including The Benedict Option, and most recently, what was also a New York Times bestseller, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents, was published while you was here. And now you are, Rod, you're back in order to, in a sense, start a network, to develop a network of like-minded institutions and people over the next few years. Thanks for being here. You are the ideal person, in a sense, to address this from the standpoint of Christian conservatism, because you have been a Catholic and you are now Orthodox.
That's
and
right.
So you bring several traditions to considering these problems. Rod.
Well, thank you, John. I want to say something briefly about this network project that John just mentioned. When I first came to Hungary, gosh, maybe it was 2018 or 2019, I was part of a group that spoke at a conference on religious liberty, and the Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, invited us all over for a session just to talk after the conference. And he said at the end of this extraordinary session that he hoped to make Budapest the intellectual capital of conservatism. Well, that sounded nice, glad to hear it, but I didn't think anything else of it. Well, it turns out that he's making good on it. I've been so impressed by the initiatives the Hungarian government and other institutions here in Hungary have made towards reinvigorating the conservative discussion. Conservatives like me, American conservatives who come here to Budapest, find that it's possible to have lively conversations that aren't really possible back home for various reasons. Since I first came here in summer of 2021, and then Tucker Carlson came here, there's been a much greater interest in Hungary and Hungarian conservatism. In fact, I just got back on Sunday from spending a week in the US, going to 2 separate conferences. So many Christian conservative academics came up to me and said, so tell me about Hungary. What's going on there? How can we learn more? So this is something I'm really excited about, because you all in Hungary are generating, I think, new ideas that we in America can use to revitalize American conservatism. So that's what I'm going to be doing here for the next few years, just putting people together. Because I found in my travels in Europe and in the US, a lot of conservative religious people just need to know each other. We don't know each other, and our framework, at least in the United States, has been set by the what Ofir calls the old conservatism, but the landscape on which we are to be conservative and to be faithful religious believers has radically changed since the 1980s. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. I think so many American conservatives, particularly social and religious conservatives, which is my tribe, are interested in Hungary and Hungarian conservatism because whether you like Viktor Orban or not, he gets the fundamental civilizational challenges facing conservatism today, facing all of us today, and he's very articulate about it. And he also has a pretty clear idea of what we should do. We don't really have that in the United States at this moment, and it's been frustrating to see it try to get launched. I think one of the reasons we don't have it is because in Europe, you're faced with these existential questions about the future of your society in ways that we haven't been yet, but I think we soon will be in the US. When I think back about the basics of conservatism, I think of something Roger Scruton wrote about how the three factors that are in every society are tribe or people, nation, religion, and politics. Roger Scruton said that conservatism, in the sense we understand it, arose to defend values of kinship and religion from the political, which was overstepping its bounds. Well, today, family, religion, and national or local sovereignty are under attack from the radicals. And not just family, the whole idea of male and female, and indeed, what is the human being, that's under attack too. It's all up for grabs, and this happened very, very quickly. Ferenc talked about coming from his conservatism was formed out of resistance to communism. I've said today that we are facing now a very different kind of tyranny, one that's similar to communism, but also very different. This book I wrote, Live Not by Lies, is based on the testimony of people who came from Hungary, from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, from Russia to the United States to escape communist tyranny, who are now seeing a very similar thing emerge in the West. I call it soft totalitarianism. It's not the totalitarianism that enforces its edicts and its values by guns and by the police state, but rather it's more like Brave New World, where we are all being sucked into this monolithic point of view we call it wokeness, that has taken over the state, that has taken over the US military, big business, as well as academia, the media, and all other institutions. We find ourselves as conservatives now in America facing a situation in which the only institution in which we exercise any authority or any power is the state, the elected government. Now, I'm 55 years old. I came of age under Reaganism, where the state was considered to be our main problem. That's no longer the case now that big business especially has gone over to wokeness. Now, and this I think is part of why so many of us look to the Fidesz party and Viktor Orban for ideas about how we can use power in the state to defend things that previously didn't need defending because nearly all Americans supported them. Things like the family, the natural family, man and woman, that sort of thing. Well, I see that conservatism and the things that we're supposed to value most of all, family, religion, sovereignty, are under attack primarily by radical individualism, by wokeness, by gender ideology, and by technology. I think that we conservatives, though, we lack a general agreement on the nature of the transcendent order. To be a conservative is most fundamentally to believe that we exist within an order that is unseen but nevertheless real, and that grounds all of our rights and our duties. To liberals, which have now become progressives, they don't believe this. They believe that values are man-made. Unfortunately, on the right, it's very difficult to find any sort of agreement among conservatives for what does this order consist of, how can we know it, and what do we owe it? I think that Ferenc is unfortunately correct that we are in a post-Christian era, and even though I am a Christian, I believe in the values of the Bible. I believe the Bible, both the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, are the stories that tell us who we are today. But this is passing into history, I'm afraid, unless we have some sort of religious revival. So what do conservatives have to say about this crisis? In my country, at least, we don't seem to have a lot, though I'm really glad that the National Conservatism Project, with which I'm affiliated, is rising because they're trying to work out what what a defense of these timeless institutions and values means in a country like the United States, which, unlike Hungary, is quite diverse ethnically, linguistically now with the rise of Spanish, and politically and religiously. I think that integralism, Catholic integralism, is a complete dead letter. It makes sense on paper, but you couldn't find one Catholic out of 1,000 who would agree that the Catholic Church ought to have serious influence in the direction of the state. So, it's fun to talk about and to speculate on, but it is wildly imprudent to waste any time, I think, thinking about integralism. So that leaves us with national conservatism, which puts, very briefly, Ofir's the guy on this, but as I understand it, it talks about putting the national interest first, that is, prioritizing, not exclusively, but putting weight on the interest of the tribe. It calls for a restoration of religion and traditions based on religion and the protection of the family, because without the family, a society can't do what all societies must do, which is produce the next generation and make it possible for them to thrive, and curbing economic freedom for the sake of serving the common good. That is to say, all national conservatives, I would say, are capitalists, but we realize that the free market is not an end in itself, but rather must be part of a general package that leads us to the end of human flourishing and of serving God. Well, but what do we have to work with? This is the thing. Hungary has a strong sense of nation, but as far as I can tell, not really of religion. You're not anti-religious in the way so many Americans are, but not too many Hungarians are in church on Sunday, alas. In Poland, when I've been there doing research the past couple of years, I hear from young Polish Catholics, that means Catholics in their 20s who still go to church and who still believe in Catholicism. They testify to me that they fear that Poland is going to go the way of Ireland within 10, maybe 20 years, where the faith will collapse. That's terrifying to me to think about, but they say it's true. And other Catholics, older Catholics I've spoken to, say this is a big threat. Why is it a threat? Well, according to one Polish high school teacher, he said that in our country, there's no institution, not the church, not the state, not the family, not the schools, nothing that is more powerful in shaping the imaginations of the young than the internet, and especially TikTok. This is something that nobody's ever had to deal with before. And I even spoke once at a conference in the US about my idea of the Benedict option of what Christians should do in a post-Christian age. And I heard a Nigerian bishop, Anglican bishop of a diocese of 3 million people speak about how in Nigeria, Christians had better start thinking about building stronger groups and social networks against modernism. And I said, well, Bishop, Your Grace, thank you so much for your kind words about my work, but a lot of us in the West look to Africa to re-evangelize us. And he said, oh no, it's very different there. He said, when you walk down the main street in my city, you see so many young people with their heads in their phones, and you can't tell if they're Nigerian or American. So the smartphone is homogenizing everything, and it is serving, I think, as the vector through which modernity, liquid modernity, is spreading around the world. Eric Kaufmann, the scholar, political scientist at the University of London, spoke to a conference here at the Danube Institute this past spring about some new research he had done about the political views of young Americans, those aged 30 and under. Overwhelmingly, they do not believe in fundamental liberal values like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. They only believe in them insofar as they don't cause harm to minorities. They don't victimize sacred minorities. Eric Kaufmann said that he was talking to a bunch of conservatives. He said, we had better fight the culture war above all other things, because if we conservatives do not do that, then there won't be any future for us, because democratic polities in the very near future will not believe in the sort of things we believe. So I think this is, to address my colleagues here, this is one of the great worries I have, is that conservatism, even as we're now trying to figure out what it is we're fighting for and how to fight for it, we may be thanks to the wokeness and power of institutions and the power of the internet to dissolve all local notions of sovereignty and so forth, we may be fighting a battle that we can't win because of the way the future generations are trending. Yeah. I hope I'm wrong, but this is something that I think Viktor Orban and the people around him understand much better than his American counterparts.
Thank you very much indeed, Rod. Now I'm going to ask a couple of questions of the speakers and then throw it open to you to put some questions. My question, Ofir, to you is, I completely agree that the importance of nationality. I wonder if you would say that when it comes to nations, would you distinguish between settler nations, and I'm not thinking here of Israel, which is a more complicated case, but of the United States, of Australia, and of Canada? Do they fit your pattern or not?
Here, they really do, because I mean there is in Europe some sense that a nation is really described or defined by its ethnicity, which I think is absolutely wrong in fact, not in theory. Meaning ethnicity is not a real fact. It is basically some kind of construct. Let's assume, I mean, if someone would say, you know, ethnicity is based on genetics, then you would be right. But until recently, people could not actually know genetically. So is there a Hungarian nation? Or maybe it's a mixing of Avars, Pechenegs, Huns, and Pannonians. So this is in the past, but you could say that about any country. I would point out that, for instance, in Britain, in England itself, the English were always very aware that they are not a homogeneous nation. They knew that Saxons and Britons and Vikings and Normans mixed all together, and many very prominent English or British nationalists were Irish. I mean, so when we say, is Tolkien an English writer? I would say, of course. Now, some people say, well, the Tolkien family actually came in the 17th century from Germany. So Tolkien wouldn't have said, yes, I'm a German or an ethnic German. He would say, I'm absolutely, totally, 100% British. So the question, I don't think it's the case of ethnic identity being the main factor. And even in countries like the United States or Australia or Canada and so on, there are two factors that are actually, I mean, for me, they make the case that these are real nations and not some kind of, I don't know, puzzle of various colors. The first is that even to begin with, the United States in 1776, 1787, whatever, in this period, the population wasn't made only of people of English descent. And at that time, well, today also, but at that time, the English and the Scottish didn't like each other at all. And so actually, there is a letter from 1774 or something like that, that some colonists are writing, the king is sending foreign soldiers to fight us. He's sending some regiments from Scotland. So, right, now, clearly there was this identity, but even at that time, there were so many people that were of different ethnic origin who saw themselves as Anglo-American. Indeed, two of the three writers of the Federalist Papers had probably not even one drop of English blood, because John Jay was half French, Huguenot, half Dutch descent, and while Hamilton was Scottish on his father's side and French maybe on his mother's side. So, and these people wrote about the American nation, our national identity, our traditions, our religion, without having one drop of ethnic blood in them. So, and the same argument was made, you know, the real American are actually the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So actually the Italians and the Irish are not exactly, but against this argument, the fact is that most Americans, even most people who come from countries with a very, very foreign culture, do believe that they're Americans and do believe in traditions which in many cases are directly derived from England. So I just mentioned one thing. It has been argued persuasively, I think, that no major American sport is not actually derived from an English sport before it. So you see, you're asking yourself, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Thank you very much. My quick question to Ferenc, to you, is you mentioned prudence as one of the central aspects of conservatism. Doesn't that fit in very comfortably with Ofir's argument that Selden's conservatism was essentially practical knowledge derived from our experience in life rather than the kind of knowledge that leads to a Lockean liberalism?
Yes, that's a good question. Thanks, John, for that. And I have to admit that here I have 100% agreement with Ofir, because John Selden is a hero of mine as well. I edited a volume of the early modern political thought in Hungarian some almost 30 years ago. And in that volume, which was based on the Cambridge School's research, Richard Tuck's essay on John Selden was included. Why? And in those days, nobody knew actually who this person might be. Richard Tuck also wrote one about Grotius, a very different kind of person of the same period, but Grotius was well known, but Selden nobody knew. But I regarded him an important author, and just for that practical reason. So, John, you are right as well that we should take good care of his. Why? Because he was not an intellectual like me, or like most of us here. I think, John, you are actually the exception in this respect, because you got close enough to politics to know the interior as well. Because I think that it's very nice that we have got these nice ideas about politics, and the other thing is to do it. And in that respect, Selden is the good, the good model who is actually involved in the practical affairs of the state, and reflecting on that and making great and powerful arguments out of those experiences. So I think that again, referring to a concept that both Ofir and Yoram emphasizes, empirical knowledge, historical empiricism, as you call it, is crucial for any kind of conservative politics, and John Selden is a good example of that.
Thank you. Rod, my question to you is about the about the nature of the religion of America's ruling class. I think Irving Kristol once said America was a country, in religious terms, a country of Indians governed by Swedes. But in those days, I think we would probably agree, the kind of secularism we had was a very relaxed and tolerant one. It now seems, on the part of the America's most important cultural and political classes, to be positively hostile to religion, and particularly to the Christian religion. What happened, and what can be done in response?
Boy, that is a massively important question, John. I remember about 2014, I think it was, I was in touch with a professor at an Ivy League law school, you know, a law school that produces many of America's top federal judges. And this man was and is a Christian, but he was living a closeted life there because he said if it were known that he was religious, his life would be very, very difficult. And he told me that one thing most ordinary American religious people don't understand is how completely alien religion of any kind is in those elite circles. He said the judges who will be produced by the Ivy League now and who will be ruling over American life for the rest of the century or much of the century are people who not only aren't religious, but they don't know any religious people. So therefore, they can't appreciate the value of religion. So I think that the true religion of American elites now, and I would include conservative elites, is rather something, well, I would say wokeness, or at least to the civil rights paradigm, where the real hero is Martin Luther King, who was an authentic American hero, don't get me wrong, but the left has taken the civil rights paradigm and has used it to advance LGBT and every other minority in American life. This and to the sacred individualism, that is the real religion of the American ruling class. And Christians, especially those who are seen to oppose LGBT, are increasingly being seen as domestic terrorists. I don't know how we deal with that other than we cannot be silent. A few years ago, a friend of mine who's a senior administrator at a Christian college in California told me about having to go around leading a delegation of other Christian college leaders to major churches in that state to try to rally support to defend Christian colleges from a new bill that was for the California legislature. The bill would have changed a state program, a very popular program that provided direct money grants to poor students to use at any accredited college, private or public, in the state of California. Well, the new bill would say, except for bigot colleges, that is, Christian colleges that don't accept the new teaching on LGBT. If that bill had passed, it would have shut down 100 colleges or forced them to violate their conscience. So this academic, college administrator I'm talking about, was going around to different colleges, different major churches to get support. He said that they went to many mega churches in Orange County, suburban Los Angeles, which has a lot of conservative evangelicals. Not one pastor would support them publicly. He said, we back you privately, but they were terrified of being called bigots. The only reason they won was Black Pentecostal leaders of South Central Los Angeles stood up for them, and the Latino Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles. But the broad middle class didn't want to have anything to do with it. I think that principle is also a real sickness at the heart of American Christianity today, that insofar as we are political at all, it tends to be this sort of mindless tub thumping. You can see some of this with Trumpism, but they still want to believe that the only thing wrong with America is the corrupt liberals who lead us. In fact, if you look back to since 1991, the number of Americans who have professed religious belief has been steadily declining, and now with the Generation Z, 30 and under, it has collapsed. So clearly, whatever happens politically, I think the best we Christians can hope for is that the state will protect our institutions enough for us to revitalize them. That is the thing that has to happen, and it can't come from the state.
Just to confirm something you've just said, and to suggest that the problem you're describing goes well beyond America, is that the recent kind of public ordinance, local government ordinance from the town of Bournemouth in England. Any of you know Bournemouth? It's a very pleasant seaside dormitory town. It has some minor industries, but it's they recently published an ordinance, actually, which, among other things, is quite a long document, actually made it an offence to cross yourself if it's if there is a protest against an abortion clinic in that street. Now, this is first of all extraordinary in that such an ordinance should have been issued on religious grounds, but the other is, it's such a pettifogging one if it goes down to every detail. So what used to be the kind of respectable classes, well, they still are the respectable classes, but they've lost touch with, in a sense, the origins of their respectability in religious terms. Now, I must be quick at this point and say we don't have a lot of time for questions, but obviously you're a very attentive audience, so I imagine you've got questions to ask. Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Levente Nyitrai, President of the Hungarian Association of the London School of Economics. Quick question to Professor Hörcher. If I understood you correctly, you said the new political conservative strategy should not be built on either nation or on Bible, but on natural law. Would you please be so kind and elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I do not claim that there is a chance to establish a general strategy for conservatism. There is no such thing. What I said that we cannot go and attack directly in an age of secularism and multiculturalism with the ideas of the nation and of the Bible. What I say that we need to find some other basis for substantiate positions, because the problem with conservatism is that, as Ofir eloquently pointed out, there are different trends, there are different traditions, and they don't easily go hand in hand with each other. So, which is good for our particular community, and which is not. What is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Think about the interwar period when conservatism went against communism, but sometimes towards national socialism in Europe. So you have to have certain limits to your conservatism, and that's all that I think that natural law can do for us, to say what not to do. And then all the other things come with your particular political leaders. You need leadership, and with leadership comes the practical wisdom, experience in politics, and a pragmatic approach to understand how to unite your camp in your back, how to get a majority out of your population. That's the requirement to win in a democratic political context.
Thank you. Another question, since that was addressed to Professor Haivry? No?
Can I say something?
Please do, yeah.
Ask Ferenc. When you say natural law, though, what do you mean by that? I mean, I think I know what you mean by that, but try to make that an abstraction like that concrete to where it is useful to politicians to make a basis for arguing for election. It just seems so remote.
Well, it's remote if we regard it as the ideas of the medieval Thomistic scholars or whatever. But if you think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what else is to support that document if not the natural law? So in fact, the liberal minimum requires an understanding of human nature, of human dignity, as the Grundgesetz of the German Federal Republic claims. Human dignity is the foundation of human rights, and that's an idea which comes from natural law. So by natural law, I mean those truths which can and should be accepted by all rational human beings, no matter what political background they have.
But does that get us anywhere when even the transgender advocates claim that they're fighting for the right of trans people to live what they believe is their true identity?
Yes, because as the classics of liberalism already pointed out, you cannot go for your beliefs if you narrow down the freedom of others. So I think actually classical liberal arguments are the best to confront the Vokes with. So that's why I say that the classical liberals are on a think about Rowling. Isn't she the paradigm case that well, for a classical liberal, wokeism is something unacceptable?
Yes, I wanted to ask Mr. Dreher something, because the point that you made about social media, and I would say the internet more broadly, I would agree that that's definitely the most destructive force that's facing everything traditional everywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how we can deal with that, because it seems if we want to respect the idea of the free exchange of ideas, we can't simply stop people by force from using the internet or shut the internet down or whatever. So what would the solution be? I mean, I can see that we can write articles and make videos telling people that this is bad, that we should return to tradition. And I think a few people will be won over, but probably not enough to reverse the trend. Right. So how can we deal with that?
Well, that is such an important question, and it's one that ought to have...
And you have to answer it in about a minute and a half.
All right. Which is hard for me. I think that two things. We have to get better at using it ourselves. We own the right better at using it ourselves. And we have to very, very strongly prevent our children from being sucked into this thing. I hear so many people have lost their children to this insanity that comes through social media, through their phones. They buy their children smartphones at a young age. This is absolute poison. And that is one of the most important things we can do. Get better at it ourselves, but also keep our kids out of this until they're old enough to deal with it. And don't just keep it away from them, but use that time to help form their moral imagination so that when they do take this into their hands, the smartphone, as they inevitably will, that it doesn't master them.
I'm afraid at that point I must end. I must, first of all, give another trailer for our meeting and a talk on Thursday on Conservatism after Boris, which will be, I think, a rip-roaring occasion. And I hope you will be here. And secondly, I want to thank our three speakers, in particular Professor Haivry, for stimulating an extremely important debate, and one which demonstrates the continuing relevance of conservatism, because so many people want to find out what it is and how it can solve our problems. And the three speakers tonight have given us three very good answers to that desire. Thank you very much indeed.